Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time today to join us for the first Saints Talk of the new year. Short presentations and lectures by leading members of our academic community on subjects that we hope are of general interest. My name is David Williams and I look after the alumni relationship with St Andrews, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening and to introduce you to Professor Don Paterson. Professor Paterson is a renowned poet, a musician, a publisher for Picador Macmillan, and Professor of Poetry in the School of English at St Andrews. His achievements are numerous, but two simple facts stand out. He has twice won not only the Whitbread Costa Poetry Prize, 2003 and 2015, but also the T.S. Eliot Prize in 1997 and 2003. His poetry collections include Nil Nil, God's Gift to Women, Landing Light, Rain, and 40 Sonnets. He has also published 3 books of aphorisms, is a translator, and has written several books of criticism and theory. He has also written drama for the stage and for radio, and for some time worked as a video games reviewer for the Times. Today, however, he is going to speak on the intriguing title, Why Bad Metaphors Destroy Everything. Professor Paterson will talk for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then he will take questions. If you do want to ask a question, you can do so through the taskbar. Please don't put your full name on it, as for data protection reasons, I won't be able to publish it. And now over to Professor Paterson. Thank you.
I'm just waiting for my screen to load and just have to confirm with Stuart that all is well.
All is good.
Fantastic. I'll get going. I apologise if this runs slightly long. I'm afraid I failed to time it and got slightly carried away. The talk's Why Bad Metaphors Destroy Everything, which is really a pathetic attempt to get your attention. But I also want to talk about symbol, about framing, which are not quite the same thing as metaphor, but they're related. Going to start with a few basic definitions, because not everybody means the same thing by metaphor, and they definitely mean about 7 different things by symbol. But you'll have to put up with mine for now. It's basically a symbol's a thing that serves to indicate an abstract quality, I'd say. I apologise if any of this is rude, tasteless, grim, and it gets slightly political if we make it through to the end. These opinions are mine alone and not those of my employer. So let's start off with the kind of metaphor poets kind of truck in, really. Metaphors are kind of useful lies, where you pretend one thing's another thing, and that helps you understand the first thing. And this is a famous one. This is Robert Frost's The Silken Tent, which was what we'd call an extended metaphor, based on the idea that a woman is a tent. It's good in a poem if your first reaction is don't be ridiculous, a woman is not a tent, because a good poetic metaphor has to be original, one which surprises and enlightens by bringing together two things similar enough to be compared but different enough to arrest and surprise you. No harm if the difference strikes you first. A woman is clearly not a tent. But by the end you go, yeah, I guess a woman is a tent, Bob, albeit, you know, qualified in that carefully quaint and rather sexist way that you do. He means in the end that a sensitive and morally upright woman is like a tent made of silk with a pole pointing to heaven, and yet at the same time tied to earth by fine guy ropes. That's his metaphor. So sometimes it's a fun game, you know, just to get students to write a really stupid first line, like, you know, he is as in a pool of bloated corpse, and just see if they can make it work. Anyway, the kinds of metaphors that we allow to rule our lives, on the other hand, don't strike us as ridiculous or stretched at all. Indeed, they often seem to us so sensible we don't really bother to question them, and we're often quite unaware of them. I'll start with maybe the most obvious lie that we tell ourselves, and this belief so all-pervasive that it's barely a metaphor at all, but if it was, it would go, things are beings that know what they are. And we have to tell ourselves this just to get up and get dressed in the morning. You know, the idea that things possess meaning. But think about that possess. Think about that things have meaning. It's not true, is it? Things don't possess meaning. Things don't know what they are. They have meaning conferred in them or invested in them. And kids have to learn what stuff means and what it does. And there's a kid doing something really sensible with a thing. He doesn't know it's an iPad. Even though we design things for a specific purpose, the meaning is never intrinsic. When we insist that things possess meaning, we're really just dragging things into our own human dream, our own unique set of human lives, but it's handy, say, to call this thing a chair because we fold in the middle and gravity's hard work and we get tired and this half bucket on stilts looks like it'll do nicely. But to like an alien with no bum, I mean, take for example this heptapod from the film Arrival, the chair is just as incomprehensible an object as this alien artifact is to us. Of course, it's a tentacle comb. Give yourself a pat on the back if you knew that one. Meaning usually relies on a way of looking at things, what we might call a context or a frame, or more technically, a domain, which is a sort of dead metaphor from dominus, master, domain meaning that which one has mastery over. And the most tyrannical frame of all is that arbitrary set of rules known as human utility, which is what we wake up to in the morning and go to sleep and dream in. But the room you're sitting in right now is really as weird as Tutankhamun's tomb, or worse, it's totally meaningless. It's chaos for all the sense it has of itself. And the sense that you make of it is all brain work, it's all neural computation. I mean, even the borders of objects aren't really a thing. And it's also a metaphor. The safe for some folk is actually God, who some people think of as a repository for all the meaning that the universe doesn't seem to have in its possession, but that's for another day. Now, in terms of more specific meanings, well, the same rule applies. What something means really just tells you who's in charge and whose rules are being applied. Something post-colonial studies has, of course, pointed out until it's blue in the face. But for example, look at these guys. They're all making the same sign of the devil's horns, but in each case it symbolizes something different because there's a different ruling cultural frame. The guy in the bottom, let's start with him, that's the Italian president, Giovanni Leone, who was twice photographed making this really uncool Neapolitan gesture of a la corna, which wards off evil. Once when he was visiting cholera patients at a hospital. It's totally uncool. Here he's just telling some hecklers where to get off. There's Gene Simmons from the band Kiss over there. He has the big tongue, giving it the old rocker's devil's horn thing because he's so evil. In his defence, he's a really unpleasant guy by all accounts. There's the irrepressible, it always says Silvio Berlusconi. He of negligible senescence, like a bloody lobster, really, making a sign behind the Spanish foreign minister. So he's basically calling him a cuck, as incels would say. That's the old Roman sign for cuckold, the idea being that you can't see your own horns and you're the last to know. And there's the Pope in the death metal band that he plays in with a Filipino archbishop. Not many people know that. Actually, that sign in the Philippines somehow means I love you. So he's telling the crowd that he loves them. So you get the point. Whatever cultural frame's dominant determines something's meaning. So if you can turn briefly to symbol, and I mean by symbol just a thing that indicates an abstract quality. Very often it's emergent from circumstance. So here's a really simple example. There's some rain, happy farmer, that's good news. There's a guy trying to have a barbecue, that's bad. If it happens a lot, the barbecue guy regards rain as a symbol of misfortune eventually. The farmer thinks it's luck, and they'll be somewhere in the middle. One person's good sign is another person's bad omen, and a third person's absolutely nothing. For the IKEA guy at the end, he's not going to be put up or down by the rain unless, I guess, he's got a barbecue that weekend. So to sum up, a symbol is a sort of true thing, but it's very restricted and constrained kind of true thing that tends to focus on one aspect of a thing and often just in a particular context. So it's literally economical with the truth. Here's an empty plate in the context of eating. That could be a symbol of hunger, although it could be a finished plate with a bit of tweaking and symbolise satiety. All depends. A metaphor is a lie, but it's also a bit true because it shows you the way in which two things are a bit the same. So there's a plate and there's the moon, and they're both white, round, cold, hard and shiny, but they're clearly different things. There's a tension between them. One's a small ceramic object, the other's the moon. The bit in the middle, the properties they share, incidentally, we refer to as the ground. And these concepts really do have sort of practical consequences for the way that we conceive of ourselves. That's to say, what symbols we make of ourselves and the meaning that we attach to ourselves. Your limitation or your possibility as an individual will depend on how you frame yourself, and we can get this wrong, or we can make the frame too narrow to admit of other possibilities. Someone, just random person, might think of themselves as a great writer, but that narrow definition, that narrow concentration of effort, might lead them to miss their real aptitude. And similarly, just to take another random example, your tragedy might depend on your operative metaphor, where you lie to yourself, how true the lie is, and whether that lie conflicts grievously with reality. So certain things work in the metaphor. The Prime Minister is a kind of king. The tension, that's to say what's different between the king and the Prime Minister, looks not too bad. Food's not as good, helmet's a bit silly. But it does omit one crucial detail, which is that whereas the king is mainly an honorific, and you can only be so bad at it, the Prime Minister is a job. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was a clever guy called George Lakoff who pointed out that we have these things called conceptual metaphors, where two different things are mapped to each other. We don't always say them aloud, but we do allow them to inform our thinking. They're often embodied, and that's to say they relate to the way we physically experience them in the world, and that's revealed in the way we talk about certain things. So my worry today is really to do with the way in which the dodgier of these mappings may shape and determine our action in ways that we're unconscious of. Here's an old example though. Love is a journey to a destination. This is the casually the way we talk of romantic relationships. We're going to make it there, honey. We had a bumpy start. Took a wrong turning. We've got a hill to climb. That sandwich you left in the glove compartment's gone off. You wouldn't say that, would you? Lakoff himself, though, has suggested that our behaviour might be changed for the better by positive reframings, which encourage better attitudes and more productive acts. I think he's kind of optimistic sometimes, though. He once proposed that the Democrats should rebrand taxes as annual membership fees, which would imply and encourage the conceptual metaphor society as a club with benefits to which you pay a subscription, until it was pointed out that, well, there's this thing called the euphemistic treadmill, where the horror of a thing always catches up with a word no matter what you call it, like all the words for toilet, which end up being toilet because there's just no getting away from it. Folk are just going to be just as upset about the size of their annual membership fees as they were about their taxes. Another thing that can happen with metaphor is that two things confuse to produce effectively a third thing, and that's when the metaphor can get all but invisible. It's still active, it's not fossilized, and that's when things get kind of dangerous. It's actually dangerous as a fossil metaphor itself, and it's cognate again with domain, goes back to Dominus, the Lord being the dude who could hurt you, makes things dangerous. Most words are fossil metaphors or metonyms like that. Where was I? Sorry, a stuffed bear is both a bear and a toy, and it can have emergent, by which we usually mean unforeseen properties. Who knew that they could be so cute? And if you doubt this, the third thing, independence as an idea, try stabbing a bear in front of a child. Actually, don't do that because somebody got arrested. Isn't that the worst slide that anyone's ever put in front of you in a PowerPoint presentation? Anyway, so I want to look at some terrible metaphors now and how we might fix them. I'm going to cough briefly. Our notion of the future is really a blend which has come through a kind of embodied metaphor. It combines the ideas of stuff in front of where the clock is now, the events that haven't happened yet, and the idea of front facing. This is really stupid metaphor. An emergent aspect is our then thinking that we can predict the future. I mean, it should be easy, right? We're looking right at it. And so we fail to prepare for it. Thinking that the future is something we can see and anticipate has led to astonishing hubris and misplaced self-confidence. But everybody knows the future's ahead of them, right? This is common knowledge. But the trouble is that a culture elides its common knowledge. We don't mention that which we assume we all know. And as a result, these ideas get almost impossible to challenge. Interestingly, the Greeks saw the future as behind them and the past ahead of them, and were sensibly fearful of that which they couldn't know. That seems a much more sensible configuration. There's a little quote from a poem by my late friend Michael Donaghy there, where he's describing the death of Hector at the hand of Achilles, where Hector looks back at the future advancing behind him to his own father, kissing the hands of this killer, the monster taking Priam's hand and weeping with him, the sound of their sobbing filling the camp. So he's seeing the future, but he's looking behind him in order to see it, which is the way that we would have thought about it. That's from a poem called Angelus Novus, which refers to this wonderful picture by Paul Klee, and this unusually lucid passage from Walter Benjamin that we needn't read, but suffice to say, this angel is facing the future in a way that is sane, because it is taking account of the horrors of the past as it does so. We fail to do that if we turn our backs on it. We need to flip the future, but it might be too late. Essentially, we're running into the future thinking we can see ahead, but the reality is a total failure to predict our current situation, from the global crash through the pandemic and the warping of reality by social media, shows that we're running in fog and could plough over a cliff edge any time soon. Another one is the environment is around us. Many of the worst metaphors turn out to be prepositional or directional. But the truth with this one is that every other animal knows this instinctively, is that we are continuous with our environment. As special as we think we are, we can't exclude ourselves from the set of natural objects. But if we cease to identify with our home, we recreationally destroy it. So seeing the planet as outside us leads to daft ideas like saving the planet, which is predicated on the false idea that the planet is sick. Planet's not sick, it's been through a damn sight worse than us. The planet is very good at making homeostatic corrections to its atmosphere and maybe even to its biosphere. Alas, it's going to cheerfully brush us off like ash on its sleeve. We are saving ourselves. Again, there's a false mapping which drives this, one of exceptionalism. Our working metaphor seems to be humans are the highest peak of a Darwinian evolution, but evolution, as you know, doesn't progress. It just does its blind, mutatey, survivally, fitesty thing. The more accurate metaphor is really humans are a spike in a plague rat population and everything will be fine, just not for the rats. Correction would be we are the environment, and in saving it, we save ourselves. Heaven is up is all well and good, and the sunsets are pretty enough in Kirriemuir these days to make you think there might be something in it. But as a metaphor, it tends to mean that we disregard what's below us on the basis that it's not heaven, it's not transcendent, and instead we seek redemption in an element, that's to say the upper air, that we don't inhabit. I think this may be another thing that lies behind our trashing our own home, that's to say some daft aspirant upwardly mobile sense that this is not our final destination. But it is. We're born, live and die here on the ground. And heaven is up comes from a weirdly persistent flat earth perspective, which also says the stars are up there. But here's a good corrective. The stars definitely aren't up. So on the next clear night, put in a big coat and lie down to look at the stars. And you'll soon see that stars are all around you and that they're under you too. Heaven is everywhere you look. And this is my pet hate, this one. People cry when you tell them that life isn't a journey. Some folk really love this. And they're often wedded to its explicit declaration, as well as casual expressions like, I'm at a crossroads, ain't nothing going to get in my way, or he has no direction. Or my mum's favourite is, oh, we'll get there. And she's always quite judiciously vague about the destination. But it's plain untruth. I mean, if life is a journey, every journey's an identically disappointing destination. Life's not a hero's tale or a novel or a film, it's a biological process. It's characterised by a finite period of negative entropy. But our knowledge of its certain ends is a real thing, and we've back-formed a dream of narrative progress, one our lives don't necessarily benefit from and very often don't achieve. Beside our narrative addictions, the time that we spend shaping our futures, or God help us, making memories, a phrase that has me reaching for my imaginary Glock, can often deny us the opportunity just to fully inhabit the present moment. And life as a journey is a literal recipe for disappointment. Surely we can correct it and it's something better that accords with our experience. It could be a journey to the sea or a circular journey, or we could spatialise it. Life is a home. Try to fill that home with things that you love and that love you, and don't worry if you like doing the same damn thing every day. If the last year has taught us nothing else, surely it's that. Otherwise, what was that about? Was the last year An entire year I spent at the Watford Gap Services of Life waiting for the AA to come and fix my camshaft because he had to send away for the part, and I ate the same pie at the Little Chef every day. Thanks, Metaphor. Or was it the year that I learned life is not a journey and I'm much happier when I don't think of staying still as a lack of progress? I think the latter. Or take death as an adversary. Death is most certainly not, and indeed is not anything, but from this idea we derive our sometimes over-prolonged and agonised brave battles with illness, as well as with the idea that COVID, say, is a wily enemy trying to kill us. Possibly there are even more pernicious expressions of that metaphor. Take the unimaginably brave NHS workers we regularly hear described with tedious regularity as heroes in the war on COVID by the government, who should be doing all it can to remove the need for their frontline heroism in the first place. Death as an adversary is also behind such daft poetic advice as do not go gentle into that good night. For heaven's sake, just go gentle. The night's coming for you either way. It also feeds into the question, are people things? Well, I don't think we are things really. We're processes, verbs, not nouns. And we really only become nouns when we're dead. People are stable sites of dynamic processes, and we love each other for what we do, which is the only manifestation of who we are. Only when we die do we suffer the transformation from verb to noun. Although if you've watched someone pass away from dementia, you'll know it can happen more gradually than that. But maybe some metaphors would be too painful to correct. My own poetic solution was something like, we don't exist, we only dream we're here. This means we never die, we disappear. I thought that I found comforting at the time. Now, given some of the species-ending horrors that we currently face, we could use some decent metaphors where currently we have none. The horrors, say, of artificial intelligence and the prospect of it running out of control while inscribed with all the moral sophistication and clarity of the Silicon Valley tech bro who programmed it, needs better than something like Frankenstein's monster, who always struck me as quite cuddly. I say bring back the golem, that would do. Nuclear war, or more of a threat than it's ever been, has fallen out of public discourse precisely because we've been unable to find a metaphor to explain its enormity to the general population. I might suggest a gas leak that, if left unattended, will, if someone strikes a match, destroy your house and your children, but since it'll do that anyway, it's technically not a metaphor. The algorithm is one we might go for. You know the algorithm I mean, the one that knows your beliefs and prejudices and likes and dislikes and browsing and purchase history better than your partner does, and keeps you on TikTok in the toilet for 3 hours the way that Tetris used to. The one that has you correcting someone for being wrong on the internet for hours on end. The one that knows exactly the buttons to push to get us to push the buttons. The clicks for rage cesspit of social media has conjured a world of stolen votes, unfettered crime, unchecked immigration, hoax viruses, deep state, useless vaccines which 5G will activate to make you zombies. Why? Advertising. Exposure to which is maximised the longer we keep clicking. We do have a great metaphor for this now, gaslighting. It's a metaphor we took from the film Gaslight, so it actually derives from a metonym because Ingrid Bergman's sanity was destroyed by the gaslight manipulators from the attic. The lights were made to flicker and dim while her husband Charles Boyer denied anything was amiss. The gaslighter creates a reality for you, which they then deny any responsibility for creating, while all the while calling you mad for believing it. Jack Dorsey, Nick Clegg, Mark Zuckerberg and the rest are gaslighters working for their shareholders, goes one theory. To finish up now, and it's not as it'll be slightly controversial, it may be very depending on where you come in here. Excuse me. I know as liberal types are justly accused of seeing both sides when the other side doesn't bother to. However, sometimes you can get so distracted by your own metaphors they can blind you in serious ways to the ones that drive the behaviour of the folk with whom you disagree. Now, lots of social phenomena are scalable. A tiny community will always find its poet, weirdly, and as Carlos Cipolla has pointed out, the same proportion of folk are stupid in every cohort, whether it's bus drivers or politicians, tennis players or Nobel laureates. You still get X number of stupid. And every coherent social group has its charismatic, bumptious narcissist who serves as both an inspirational and divisive figure. This is, of course, a random slide. But Trump, I have to say, was different. On the left and the centre, we saw Trump as a kind of Satan figure, a terrifying clown, a horribly useful idiot for a bunch of greased servants in the GOP, and talked of him in those terms. but that meant that we failed to see what metaphor was operating for many of his supporters. Now, I don't mean those high-earning, middle-class white folks who voted for Trump. We don't need to explain those. They did so for the same reasons of self-interest. Certain people will always vote for the dude who offers tax cuts. It's the massive poorer white folk we need to explain, and because we're now terrible at talking about class, they become unreadable to many of us. But we should have listened to the language that Trump used about himself and how it was echoed back to him, and this would have given us the correct mapping, the metaphor, and it was really obvious. Read this tweet that he retweeted. Thank you to Wayne Allen Root for the nice words. President Trump is the best president for Israel in the history of the world, and the Jewish people in Israel love him like he's the king of Israel. They love him like he's the second coming of God. Reinforcement from the likes of Cardinal George Pell from his present diaries, not really up to Mandela standards, I have to say. Trump is a bit of a barbarian, but in important ways, he's our barbarian. His supporters, he walks in water as far as I'm concerned, they're trying to crucify him. He can do no wrong. He's not holding the Bible upside down, by the way, but he did do a good impersonation of a man who didn't really know how to work a book. The point about Trump and many of his followers was that he redeemed them. No one is for 1 second diminishing the considerably more grievous injustices visited on the black community, but this was a worn down constituency, their healthcare and employment insecure, so desperate for change and indifferent to politics, they'd have voted for Sanders, but they'd been told they should be ashamed of themselves for their alleged racism, their backwardness, their evangelical Christian faith, their lack of inclusivity, and for cultural products and artefacts of their own poverty, from their cheap phones to their diabetes. And he was an individual, full of sin and flaw and wickedness, who had entirely forgiven himself, who was shameless, and who would wash any follower's sins away in a heartbeat, redeem them, and in one stroke return their lost pride. And just as the left still don't understand that if you isolate someone, ostracize them, it makes them 100 times more dangerous, they don't understand that it gets you nowhere by trying to make people feel ashamed. Shame, weirdly, turns out not to be the great driver of solidarity between constituencies who should naturally bond. Why was there no great alliance of black and white poor is one of the many questions you will not hear the left ask themselves this week. What shame does do is make folk vulnerable to anyone who will claim to remove it in one fell swoop. But if we fail to understand Trump the Redeemer, we will fail to see what's assuredly coming next. And as usual, America is keen to do its healing long before it's bothered to hold those who made the wounds to any account. And this is a bipartisan issue. There are terrible people on both sides. Metaphors are predictors of the future. Trump has already said chillingly he'll be back in some form. And remember, the Redeemer rises again. And when he does so in a far more impressive and potent incarnation. And if you don't know who this is, you're lucky. Finally, we were perhaps naive to think that we'd live out our term without at least one cataclysm of the sort that's often marked the lives of our forebears. But for all the awful tragedy and bereavement and suffering and loneliness and fear the virus has caused, we don't yet know if we've got our metaphors quite right. We talk of virus as a wily enemy, always looking for holes in their defences. We talk of war zones and horror shows and train wrecks. But some virologists say we may have also dodged a bullet. Why? Well, miserably, this may not be the big one, the mutated bird flu that really will decimate us. But if it isn't, maybe the virus is the vaccination. We are, for once, a little wiser and better prepared for our own future, and perhaps if not inoculated against the worst it can do to us, we now have a few of the right antibodies. My favourite reframing story is told in many forms, but the simplest version is Taoist. Somewhere in rural China, a farmer's house has caught fire and is burning down. His neighbour walks up to commiserate with him and he says, well, that's bad luck. And the farmer just looks a long while at the embers of his home and says, we'll see. This is me coming out of my PowerPoint.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for sharing the worst slide ever in a PowerPoint.
Thank you, David.
I wouldn't like to comment on whether that's the case or not. I'm going to go to a comment first from Eric. Really, this is a comment. He says, this was exactly what I needed today. And this lecture reminds me so much of what I loved about my time at St Andrews studying literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. It's very gratifying.
So we're going to post our event survey in the chat bar. So if you get the opportunity, please do let us know how we can improve events in the future, and also any comments that you have. So we're going to open up now to questions, and Eric has followed up with a question. Who was the fellow in the slide after Trump?
That was that was a man called Tucker Carlson, who's one of the most effective and most right-wing communicators currently on the Fox News channel, and who many of us believe is positioning himself for a run in 2024, and he will almost definitely have the support of Trump's own followers, especially if he chooses to direct him over there.
Thank you. Now a question from Simon, who says he agrees with Eric, by the way. Is there a metaphor you have adapted that has changed your outlook and therefore your life? Sorry, adopted that has changed your outlook and therefore your life?
There probably is, and I'd have to go away and think about it. I bet there is. I mean, I think one of the things about successful metaphors is that they're quickly absorbed. And that's my excuse for not being able to remember which one might have had that effect. I think what I've been doing more conscientiously is the sort of thing I was just describing in that lecturette, which is trying to strip out the ones that I find are really not effective. I found it took a long time to get rid of the life as a journey thing. The sense that one should be building on one's accomplishments, and you start to realise that even the idea of achievement and accomplishment themselves are really bad metaphors and can often lead to an awful lot of unnecessary happiness. So I've been trying to strike out a lot of the pointless directionality, weirdly, and I think funnily enough lockdown's been really useful to that end. I think it's okay to have the same day twice. I used to think that was a colossal waste of one's time. It's not. It can be a decent life and a life worth living. So I'm far less committed to the journey than it ever was, I think.
Question from Mike. What is your favourite positive metaphor, assuming you have one?
Life is a bowl of cherries. These are all the kind of brilliant questions that ideally one would have done some prep for. Your questions are magnificent, but I just, my mind immediately goes blank. It's quite funny, really, because I've just positioned myself as some kind of metaphor spot kicker. It turns out there's nothing else to say. I can't think. I've got lots of favourite metaphors, but they're probably poetic. Yeah.
I'll try a question from Nicola. Maybe the very reason life is a journey is such a dominant metaphor is that it is an essential archetype which we can't really do without, question mark.
I think that's sort of true. I think it's worth the struggle is the only thing that I'd say. And I think one of the problems is we have to, I think life as a journey is one way of coming to terms with the foreknowledge of one's own death. And I think we're very unusual mammals in that regard. You know, I don't think, other animals suffer in quite the same way. And I think having that knowledge that you know that you're going to die from quite a young age plunges you into a kind of weird existential position of sort of ghosthood when you're both here and not. And I think it's kind of inevitable in order to not feel like a ghost, that you start to sort of give yourself meaning and purpose and direction and back form from death itself. The ideas like journey, ideas like achievement, ideas like a path and a road. I think what's important and where metaphor is important is that meaning is important. We have to give our lives meaning, and I think that's our contribution to the universe. I don't think the universe is without meaning, because we're part of the universe and we're meaning generating machines. It's just that I don't always buy the kinds of meaning that we make, And I think one of the liberating things is to see the amount of choice that you have over the kind of meaning that you can create. You needn't be beholden to those received metaphors that sometimes you've never even had the opportunity to hold to the light before, that are only revealed in kind of unconscious tells. And I think it's worth digging them up to see if you want to recommit to them, or to see if you want to twang them for something that you might find less disappointing, that might lead to less pain. I don't believe in archetypes, so I think everything's up for revision if we want.
An anonymous question here. How do you police and control your own use of bad metaphors in everyday life? And is it possible?
Well, there's two kinds of metaphor. There's metaphors that inform your own decision making and your own choices, and that's just trying to live, and that's just trying to be self-aware and live an examined life. And that's all I'm really proposing from a little talk. Unfortunately, if you're involved with poetry for part of one's living, you do police your own metaphors. But these are literary metaphors that I find bad for a number of reasons. So I could tell you why I occasionally find my own written metaphors, my own poetic metaphors really bad, certainly. The main reason, I don't know if it's instructive, is that they really work individually, but they don't work in the poem. They're really clever, but they only work as a kind of table firework, and they don't relate to the rest of the poem in any way. So one wins a round of applause from oneself, but actually, it destroys the art. So anytime you feel like congratulating yourself, you've usually screwed up, is my rule. Anytime you've done something that makes you feel clever, you haven't. It's quite Calvinist, isn't it?
Can I say, during these talks, I usually write down quotes in order to kind of advertise them to the alumni community afterwards. But I found I've just run out of ink through this entire talk. There's so many superb quotes that it's going to be a struggle to pick them. Moving to Helen, asking as a strong journey making memories phobe, which is a great phrase. Which is worse, unthinking living with the comfort of bad metaphors, or being incapable of generating metaphor at all?
Which is worse? Oh, wow. I don't believe that one isn't capable of making metaphor, because I think metaphor making is a human reflex. And again, it's going back to this thing about, unfortunately, us being meaning-making creatures, which means is another way of saying we're creatures of symbolic connection. We can't help but connect any two things that we that are chucked at us. Any two things we encounter will forge a link between them, and that's a kind of metaphor. All a metaphor is a connection that you identify between two things that share a property. And all we do is make connections all day long. So, so I don't think there's such a thing, as someone who can't make metaphors. I think that's just literally the way our brains work. But I think the point is to take control over the procedure rather than find ourselves just passively, sort of ruled by these unexamined, often cultural metaphors that can shape our entire lives.
Another anonymous question here. I like the notion of the virus being the vaccine. My question is about how you start working with your own writing and with your students to explore this health crisis, or is it too early?
Oh, such a good question. Such a good question. I mean, I think because the trouble is, just like we have this association as poets between painful experience and poetry, to the point that it's an occupational hazard, because a lot of poets, that think of themselves as poets, and are poets, actually go out of their way to seek painful experience because they know from painful experience it gives them subject matter. And it's really bad because all of a sudden we're inundated with subject matter, which is a rare thing. You'd think The trouble is, I think we're all too close to it. I think that it's I don't believe that poetry is emotion recollected and tranquility, but I do believe that you need some distance for things to be original. I don't think there's. I don't know what I'm saying. I think poetry will emerge from this, but it's far too early. The reason it's too early is that, you know, where the poetry happens is in your peripheral vision. It's in the things that you know, off to the side that you haven't noticed. And you know, and the trouble with this pandemic is all our eyes are front right now. And we can't help but look directly at it. We can't help but spend our lives doom scrolling through the latest news, and that's not where the poetry happens. So it's not until we feel safe enough to look away, I think, that we'll be able to sing anything very original about it. And also, there's nothing much poets have to contribute right now. Poets have something to contribute when people need something to feel that they're not feeling. I think right now we're all feeling the same thing, so we just need to sort of hang tight and stay close. The poets will, you know, sort of all have their role further down the line.
This is from Callum. Do you have a process in your writing for constructing good metaphors?
So no, I wouldn't say a process, but I've got a sort of rule, which is that it can't be too close and it can't be too far apart. You can't just go, you know, oh, banana's like a television, and you go, well, it's not really. It's not like a television. It's a terrible metaphor. And at the same time, you can't say, oh, that apple looks just like a peach, or that can of 7-Up. It's just a bit like a can of Coke. Have you noticed that? That's a bad metaphor as well, because they're virtually the same thing. So I mean, a good metaphor in a poem basically has to have difference as well as connection. So it has to. The whole point of a metaphor, you know, is for a poet is that the connection should surprise. It should be unexpected, you know, and you want the reader, as a result of your surprising connection, to be shocked into this wakeful moment. Because you're showing something that they haven't seen before. So I always go back to Robert Frost and his old line, you know, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. If it doesn't surprise me when I've written it, in the act of writing it, then it definitely won't surprise you either. So that's a bit my only rule, really.
Question from Chase, who's also thanking you for a great talk. It seems there's a connection between cliche and bad metaphors. Do you think that any of the examples of the bad metaphors you gave are useful in the right context?
These are like literally this is the hardest Q&A I've ever had in my entire life. I know because it's lockdown and when I was alone, but it's these are really hard questions. I'm going to stick my neck out and I'm going to go no. And I think the reason is that I picked these ones out precisely because I feel that they've done so much damage. It was not entirely true, because I do think there are occasions where people have found comfort in the death as an adversary one, for example, and find a lot of comfort in that Dylan Thomas poem that I don't like. I fell out with David Baddiel, of all people, because that was his favourite poem, and he wrote me a kind of it's friendly but mostly angry letter about the fact that I'd trashed it, when actually when he was going through his own father's death, he found the poem a great comfort. So I've sort of modified my position considerably after that, which I should have done in the first place. If it helps you through, it's for you, that's fine. Yeah, of course. One wouldn't want to deny anyone comfort, especially now. I think all I was saying is it's not for me, because I think they do more harm than good on balance. But there are always situations where it's going to be a comfort. I think of life as a journey, or love as a journey, or death as a foe. Of course.
This is from Dan. Is metaphor a characteristic of language or of human thought itself? Without language, would we have metaphor?
Yeah, I think it's sort of complicated, and I've written a long and incredibly boring book on the subject, and I think it's actually a product of physical law. Things either happen in sequence, which is metonymy, and things like sentences and syntax, or they connect, which is metaphor. And the universe does this. It's the two ways that it works, and it's the two kinds of processes that inform the way that our brains work. They either work by rule or they work by connection. Humans do something else, which is they do symbol, they do meaning. They can extract meaning by sort of feeding the system back into itself, and it spits out something we call symbol or call meaning. Call it what you like, but that's the thing that makes life worth living. I think metaphors just happen anyway, but if you didn't have metaphor, you would have no connection, and if you didn't have any connection, you wouldn't be able to get your shoes on. So I think it's definitely sort of absolutely hardwired, and not a part of life one would want to avoid, not good.
A couple of questions on different languages. This from Alistair. Thanks for doing this, Don. Really appreciate it. Is there a value in looking across the globe and into different languages to refresh our metaphors?
Absolutely. I mean, it's I find that especially in my case, looking at poetry and translation, because I'm barely a monoglot. Far less can I read any other language fluently, but I do find that looking at the sort of the symbol repertoire that other poets deploy can really shake your old habits as a writer, and you know, and can really move your thinking along. And of course, as soon as I say that, I can't think of a damn example. But it's I think. Nonetheless, I suspect that outside of those anomalous examples that people give about, certain more less complex cultures not having words for the future or not being able to count beyond three or all that kind of stuff. I think for the most part, our brains are pretty much the same. And I think with that in mind, the underlying cultural metaphors that tend to inform most of our larger decisions are probably the same. But the surface expression of the language is just as important, and it can be very, very different from certainly one poetry to another. And the way that, the elemental qualities of Spanish poetry I find incredibly invigorating. The way, the whole via negativa thing. The way they talk about the soul so freely in a way that would just embarrass an Anglophone. It's not quite a metaphor, but I think it's you shouldn't get your culture is your language, and never moving outside of your own literature means not traveling in a sense, and it does narrow the mind. Yeah.
This is from Ewan on why we in the West moved from the Greek conception to the English conception. Do you have a sense of why we, whoever we may be, turned around to face towards the future?
Wow, I don't know. I suspect just hubris, and I suspect the kind of hubris that comes with winning, in the Trumpian sense. We got bored of winning. And I think that kind of really puffs you up. If you keep getting nothing but wins, imperial wins, I think it makes you far less cautious. And you start to sort of credit yourself with what essentially is a divine power, which is what you do when you think you can see it in the future. You're proclaiming yourself a prophet as a society if you flip it around that way. But I just think it's hubristic. It's just a misplaced imperial overconfidence, I suspect.
An interesting challenge from Lauren here. So metaphors are a kind of religion in that they help one to decipher their thoughts and imagination. And don't they assist those who might have trouble communicating their feelings to others by creating a, quote, common, unquote, language?
Yeah, There we go. I'll just fold. But that's always a worry. I always find it far too easy to fold with just when presented with a barrage of common sense. That seems right. I don't think I'm saying that those metaphors. I think one or two of them have been absolutely disastrous. I think the talk about the environment as being around us has been a disaster. Rather than to see yourselves as continuous with it. I think others is kind of horses for courses, and some of them could be extremely comforting. And you know, and as she says, they can sort of also function as a kind of symbolic lingua franca, you know, between people, you know, sort of as shared cultural tokens and shared ways of looking at the world that are easily understood. So I think that's true. I do think there's a heavy downside with a lot of them, but sometimes that downside is maybe more manifest at a cultural rather than an individual level. But point taken.
This is a question, and I'm terrified now of getting myself into some kind of journey metaphor on your poetic quote unquote process. Does your critical anonymous question? Does your critical control and understanding of metaphor, did it ever affect your writing of poetry yourself?
I think there's always a problem, and you know, it's a problem that comes with, you know, sort of doing, you know, sort of being an educator and, you know, and teaching this stuff for a living, which is that you are having to dredge up the machinery in order to, to point at cogs and wheels and explain how things work. And sometimes it's hard to get all that machinery below the waterline again, and it means that sometimes when I go back to trying to write poetry, I feel much more self-conscious about all that stuff because all I can see is machinery. It looks like the Matrix sometimes. I mean, I can look at a point when it just looks like numbers and I can see that that line's wrong, and if you move those two lines the other way around, then that metaphor is duff and this one doesn't scan too good. But you know, but that doesn't make you able to do anything right. You just become like a machine for seeing what's not working. So I think the danger with too deep an involvement with this thing is sometimes it's hard to get back into it innocently. I think you hope at the end of the day that anything that you know about your art form improves the quality of your intuitive and instinctive decisions within it. Just it sometimes takes a long time to get back to it, I think, and to find that kind of innocent space again, but you're not analysing it in this way.
Another question from Ray about metaphor and other writing systems. What kind of metaphoric process do you think might be taking place in ideographic writing systems such as Chinese or Japanese, and how does this affect their poetry?
I don't know. No idea. It depends who you talk to, and it's just like, but the only people to talk to, you know, about this stuff are like, you know, go talk to John McWhorter. I've got no idea. I think what tends to happen is that, you know, and we've seen this in poetry through Ezra Pound's farcical engagement with ideograms via Fenollosa at the start of the last century. You know, it was actually a productive mistake in some way. You know, he kind of, you know, he forged a kind of imagism off the back of a total misunderstanding of how ideograms work in other languages. But I think the parts that look most salient to us as outsiders, you know, things like the representational aspect of writing systems are much less apparent to people who are inside it. You know, it's that old mistake that people always make about thinking that the thing that looks most salient to them is the thing that's most important to you. It's like when you travel abroad and do a reading and they go, "How does it feel to be a Scottish poet?" And you go, "I got no idea." That's like, you know, how does it feel to have toenails? I've got no idea. I think languages are the same, you know, and I suspect at a cognitive level that there are far more similarities between the way we think inside them than there are serious differences. But I've got no expertise and no basis for arriving at that conclusion. So I'm going to just stop talking because I don't know what I'm talking about.
Thanks, Professor. We're heading to an hour there, and apologies for the enormously challenging set of questions that alumni have thrown at you. We've still got another 25 to go. I'm just in correspondence with one of the viewers, Chris, just to say we had a huge number of questions for this, and we've only managed to get through about a dozen or so. So I'm just going to move to a final question now. So apologies to everybody who asked a question that didn't get asked. So this is from Conrad. Does academic experience make it more difficult for you to be surprised by your own writing?
Yes, and I consider that, and you know, and I've had a long time to think about this, and I think it's a good thing too. I think that you know, it would be a terrible thing if one was constantly surprised and delighted by one's own writing. William McGonagall lived in a state of constant inspiration. I always remember that. He was constantly surprised and self-delighted at his own work. So I think anything that reduces that surprise or makes it harder to surprise yourself is probably good for quality control. So.
And just to say, thank you very much, Professor Paterson, for spending an hour with the alumni and friend community to St Andrews. If you haven't filled out our event survey yet, please do so. The link is in the chat. And thank you very, very much for taking the time to join us. If you've enjoyed this event, you can watch previous Saints talks on our YouTube channel, as well as the Global Burns Night, which we broadcast yesterday. And you can follow us on our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And just to reiterate my thanks to Professor Paterson for his time and sharing his thinking and understanding with us tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.